Well, taking a look outside right now, you may not exactly think of the weather as something to sing about, or maybe you would. Think of the number of songs that have been written about the rain and what it's like to be lost in the rain, or the rhythm of the rain, etc. But according to new research, weather was also on the mind of many classical composers when they were writing their masterpieces. Two British atmospheric scientists have published the first scientific survey of weather conditions in classical music. And our science columnist, Michael Bardwaj, is here with that. Hello there.
Hello, Ellen.
Okay, I think we ought to hear an example here.
All right, let's start off and take a listen to this. So that is an excerpt from Richard Strauss's Alpine Symphony, which the German composer scored in 1915. The symphony was inspired by a hike along the cliffs and in the valleys of the Alps, and at one point, our hikers, they're blindsided by a storm. Right. And as we just heard there, it's quite a dramatic storm that captures them, right? It evokes images of whipping winds and peals of thunder. And this just happens to be one example of the many symphonies and operas surveyed by two British atmospheric scientists in this new study that's coming out in the November issue of the journal Weather.
So why did they actually want to do this? Why did they want to look at weather in classical music?
Well, you know, for Karen Aplin, one of the scientists on this, it was this hunch that kept nagging her while she played with her orchestra in the evenings. See, Karen is the lead double bass in the Henley Symphony Orchestra in Britain. And since her instrument tends to anchor the sound of an approaching storm, you know, the deep drone of a double bass that can only mean bad news is on the way, well, Karen couldn't help but notice just how often all kinds of other weather conditions cropped up in their classical repertoire. So she started making this sort of informal list of all the classical works that reference the weather, and eventually she went back to her day job at Oxford as an experimental physicist. So double bass by night, experimental physicist by day.
Another story like that. Yes.
And she discovered that no one had ever investigated the connection between what happens in the sky and what we hear in our ears. So then Karen leans over, she recruits a colleague of hers, a fellow weather scientist by the name of Paul Williams, who in the evenings plays piano and sings in a choir. And the two of them decided to marry their professional and personal interests on their own time by setting out to study the sound of weather in classical music. Now, this study, first, offered them the chance to take a closer look at the kind of weather that some of the great composers, such as Strauss or Vivaldi, even Beethoven, were inspired by, and how they interpreted that weather in their own music.
And what did they find?
Well, first, they looked at 35 pieces of orchestral music from the Baroque period all the way to the present day that referenced weather in some way. And what they noticed right off the bat was that good weather is always rooted in a major key, which Paul Williams says is happy sounds. Bad weather, on the other hand, began in a minor key, the sound of sad. And there was a lot of bad weather in this, Alan, in these symphonies and operas. 20 of the 35 pieces surveyed included thunder and lightning and howling winds sweeping through parts of the score. But you know, the most interesting discovery for Karen and Paul was the fact that the composers wrote about the rough weather that was right in their very own backyards.
Which I guess makes sense. Yeah.
It does make sense. You know, what I mean by that is that, you know, British composers, they would score music inspired by frontal storms. And these are storms that race across the Atlantic Ocean and bash against the coast of the UK. In fact, there's one British composer named Benjamin Britten who evokes these gales of wind and rain in his opera, Peter Grimes. You can just hear the wind and waves crashing against the coast there, right?
Feeling
so that's from Peter Grimes.
Okay.
And that's the weather in Britain that we're hearing there. But over in mainland Europe, the storms sound more like this. So that's a piece from Beethoven's Sixth Symphony called Thunderstorm. And according to our researchers, what we're hearing there is an interpretation of a convective storm. Storms with lots of thunder and lightning that erupt from towering clouds of moist hot air.
I can just picture Beethoven sitting there and going like, yeah, I'm really seeing towering clouds of moist thick air. I think this is more of a convective.
I'm not sure he had the terminology, but he certainly had that view outside of his window, because a lot of these storms happen only over Central Europe. You're not going to find these storms in Britain. So that's why he was interpreting them in sound. And in fact, these patterns were so strong throughout all of the classical music that they surveyed. And it came as quite a surprise to both Karen and Paul.
But why were they surprised? I just asking because most musicians, when they're sort of looking for inspiration, they would look out their window and be inspired by what's closest. Why were they surprised they were inspired by local weather?
I mean, it's true. I think the point that you're making is that it seems kind of obvious here that they would be inspired by the weather outside. And as much as it influenced the composers, it has the same kind of effect on us. As Paul was telling me, so many of our daily decisions take the weather into account. You know, what we wear as we head out the door, whether you choose to drive to work or walk instead. But in the case of these classical composers, the weather wasn't that simple, fleeting thought to reach for an umbrella on the way out. In fact, weather was a muse. It was this force that helped them shape the sound of their scores, that added drama and tension and metaphor to their stories and challenged their musicians to capture the fury of Mother Nature with their instruments. And what this adds up to, according to Karen, is another valuable perspective on the cultural response we have to weather and the environment. We've seen this response. It's been documented heavily in art. Well, this is the first time that there's been a comprehensive survey of weather and music. And they're interested to keep, these two are interested to keep their ears open for how this response might change over the coming years as climate change continues to have an effect. I mean, it may be that future composers will score even bigger storms, possibly even hurricanes that we're seeing sweep across the globe as temperatures continue to rise.
So where do they go now with the study?
Well, now that they've surveyed classical music, Paul Williams was telling me that they might turn their attention to contemporary sounds next. So they may spend some time scanning and cataloging all those sort of newish pop songs that crop up and reference weather in some way. So, Alan, it may be that in a year from now I'm sitting across from you and talking about one of the cultural imprints of one of your most favorite songs of all time, which would be, I think it's Milli Vanilli's Blame It on the Rain that you mentioned.
Of course, yes.
Sing it out, come on. Blame it on the rain.
And we'll go out on that. Yeah. We played Blame It on the Sun by Stevie Wonder a little bit earlier.
Well, okay, that's a much better song.
That's what we're waiting for people to mix together, if they can blame it on the rain and the sun in the same tune. But it's interesting because you don't necessarily think of a lot of the songs that now mention rain or the weather of any kind. They're not necessarily working the sound of the songs don't necessarily mirror the weather itself. No. Maybe people have examples of where the weather actually is mirrored in the way the music is composed. They can send it in to us.
Peoples, I Can't Stand the Rain.
Yes.
You remember that one?
Yes. That
right actually, off the bat.
There you go. That's true. It has that syncopation. What's the word I'm looking
the
for?
Little raindrop sound at the top.
Yes, at the very beginning. So if people have examples of something where the actual composition actually mirrors the sound of weather, let me know. allinaday@cbc.ca, or you can send a tweet to us at CBC All In a Day. Thanks, Michael.
You're welcome.
That's Michael Bardwaj, our science columnist.